At 2:47 in the morning, somewhere over the Persian Gulf, a formation of drones disappeared from friendly radar. They hadn't been shot down, they hadn't malfunctioned, they had simply entered a zone where detection becomes nearly impossible. And on the other side of that darkness, millions of people had no idea how close the world was to something catastrophic. This is the story of the night Iran nearly crossed the line of no return. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand the decades of pressure that had been building beneath the surface. The Middle East has never been a quiet region, but the relationship between Iran and the West, particularly the United States and Israel, represents one of the most complex and dangerous standoffs in modern geopolitical history. Iran has been living under crushing economic sanctions for years, its currency battered, its population frustrated, and its leadership increasingly defiant. Rather than retreat, Tehran responded the only way authoritarian regimes tend to respond to existential pressure, by accelerating its military capabilities. Ballistic missile programs expanded. Proxy networks across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen grew stronger. And most critically, Iran's nuclear enrichment program crept closer and closer to weapons-grade thresholds, each step a deliberate provocation calculated to send a message without technically crossing the final red line. But provocations have a shelf life. And eventually, a moment arrives that is different from all the others. That moment began with intelligence. Western and Israeli surveillance assets, satellites, signals intercepts, human intelligence networks operating at extraordinary risk, began picking up a pattern of unusual military coordination inside Iran. Revolutionary Guard units that were normally stationed in separate regions were repositioning. Long-range ballistic missile batteries in the Zagros Mountains were observed entering what analysts described as a heightened readiness posture. Underground facilities, the kind built specifically to survive airstrikes, were showing increased activity. At the same time, Iranian-backed militia forces in Iraq and Syria began receiving what appeared to be encrypted operational orders. Hezbollah in Lebanon reportedly mobilized additional rocket units along the northern Israeli border. The Houthis in Yemen, already engaged in a grinding conflict, recalibrated their drone and missile launch vectors toward the Red Sea. The picture was becoming clear, and it was alarming. In response, the United States quietly repositioned assets across the region. A carrier strike group, already operating in the eastern Mediterranean, was redirected southeast. B-52 strategic bombers deployed to the region. Their presence a deliberate, visible signal that Washington was watching and prepared. American destroyers equipped with advanced Aegis missile defense systems took up positions capable of intercepting ballistic trajectories originating from Iranian territory. F-35 squadrons at bases across the Gulf went to elevated alert status, their pilots placed on short-notice standby. Israel, for its part, activated its multi-layered air defense architecture. Iron Dome, David's Sling, and Arrow 3, each system designed to intercept threats at different altitudes and ranges. Israeli Air Force assets were repositioned. Intelligence coordination between Tel Aviv and Washington intensified to a tempo that hadn't been seen since the most dangerous moments of previous regional crises. And somewhere in the darkness above the Persian Gulf, those drones continued flying. Military analysts watching the situation were deeply concerned, not just because of the scale of the mobilization, but because of what it suggested about Iranian strategic thinking. For years, Tehran had operated through plausible deniability, using proxies to strike targets while maintaining just enough distance to avoid direct military retaliation. But the pattern emerging that night suggested something different. It suggested coordination. It suggested command authority flowing from the very top of the Iranian military structure. When the Revolutionary Guard and proxy networks operate in synchronized fashion under centralized direction, that changes the strategic calculation entirely. It shifts the scenario from a proxy skirmish, which both sides have learned to absorb, to something that looks far more like a deliberate, orchestrated offensive. And an orchestrated offensive demands a direct response. The concern among defense experts was that Iran may have miscalculated the threshold, that in trying to demonstrate strength and resolve, Tehran was pushing into territory where the United States and Israel would feel compelled not merely to defend, but to strike back in a way that fundamentally degraded Iran's military capacity. That is a very different kind of war than the shadow conflict that had been playing out for years. The escalation scenarios were being wargamed in real time. If Iran or its proxies launched a significant strike on American forces or Israeli civilian and military infrastructure, the response would not be limited. Strikes on Iranian missile batteries, command and control nodes, and potentially nuclear facilities would be on the table. Iranian leadership knows this, which is precisely what made the moment so dangerous. They were playing a game of brinkmanship where the Margin for error had effectively vanished. Regional consequences would not stop at Iran's borders. A direct military confrontation would send oil prices surging, destabilize already fragile governments across the Arab world, and potentially pull in other global powers who have strategic interests in the region. Russia, which has developed close military ties with Iran, would face pressure to respond diplomatically or otherwise. China, deeply invested in Iranian oil and regional influence, would be forced to take a position. What begins as a regional crisis has pathways towards something far larger and far harder to contain. The world in that scenario does not look like the world of proxy conflicts and targeted strikes. It looks like something the international system has been carefully trying to avoid for decades. What ultimately prevented that night from becoming a defining catastrophe? A combination of factors, none of them permanent, none of them guaranteed to hold next time. Back-channel communication between parties who technically don't speak to each other. The visible deployment of American military power as a deterrent signal. The recognition on someone's part, whether in Tehran, in a militia headquarters in Baghdad, or in a room full of Revolutionary Guard commanders, that the cost of proceeding outweighed the benefit of the message being sent. But here is what every serious analyst of this region understands. The pressure that built to that flashpoint has not been released. The nuclear program continues. The proxy networks remain intact. The sanctions remain in place. The strategic distrust between Iran and the West is as deep as it has ever been. What was paused that night was not a conflict. It was a countdown. The Persian Gulf is not a region the world can afford to stop watching. The systems that prevented war this time, military deterrence, intelligence sharing, quiet diplomacy, are not infallible. They depend on rational actors making rational calculations under extreme pressure in the middle of the night, with incomplete information and enormous stakes. History has shown us again and again that those conditions are not always sufficient. The night Iran almost started a war is not a story with a comfortable ending. It is a warning about how fragile the line between crisis and catastrophe truly is, and how quickly the world can find itself standing on the wrong side of it. If this kind of in-depth geopolitical and military analysis is what you come here for, subscribe and hit the notification bell. New deep dive documentaries drop every week. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what's really happening in the world. And if you want to go deeper, check out our full breakdown of Iran's missile program and proxy network strategy linked right now. The story doesn't end here, and neither does our coverage.